Good afternoon, folks. I hope everybody is doing well today. This is going to be the first lecture in my lesson on animal respiratory and gas exchange systems. If you are in my biology class, you should probably go on Blackboard and get a copy of the handout for this lesson so that you have convenient vocabulary terms for when we're discussing things. Also, if you happen to have your textbook handy, you probably want to have that around for when I get to the part where I talk about bird respiratory systems, because they in particular are a little bit weird and might require a little bit of extra visualization. All right, now you already know that as an animal, you are dependent on aerobic respiration. Although your cells are capable of engaging in lactic acid fermentation if they have to, that does not generate enough energy to keep you powered. So you must have a steady supply of oxygen coming into your body to power your cellular respiration process. Likewise, if you're engaging in aerobic respiration as your chief way of generating ATP, you are continually generating waste in the form of carbon dioxide. And that needs to be removed from your body consistently, elsewise you will end up dying of hypercapnia. If you don't know that word, Hypercapnia. Hypercapnia is excessive carbon dioxide levels. Now, what really kills you is blood acidosis, but you know. Now, what this means is that as an animal, you must have mechanisms for frequent gas exchange with the environment. You have to be able to regularly take up oxygen from the environment and release carbon dioxide. Now, in my preceding lesson where I talked about circulation, we tended to focus on gas exchange at the other end of the cycle. We talked a little bit about, okay, blood delivers oxygen to the tissue and releases carbon dioxide into the tissue to be removed. I also did say that in your pulmonary circuit of circulation, that carbon dioxide diffuses out into the lungs and oxygen diffuses in. But we need to pay more attention to that receiving end, to the mechanisms by which an animal collects oxygen from its environment and releases carbon dioxide waste. Collectively, these are all referred to as gas exchange. Gas exchange is ultimately necessary not only to support cellular respiration, but also to furnish oxygen that your body needs for other chemical purposes. And, of course, to remove the metabolic wastes resulting from the respiratory process. I should preface all of this by saying that we're using the word respiration two different ways here that are related but not the same thing. In this chapter, I am talking about mechanical respiration, the action of moving oxygen into and out and carbon dioxide out of your body, the ventilation of the body. That's a term that's often used. Ventilation, V-E-N-T-I-L-A-T-I-O-N. Whereas respiration, as we've often used it prior to this in biology, has been cellular respiration, the process by which our cells break down glucose and other food molecules to make ATP. There's obviously a strong link between these because the particular form of respiration you as an animal get most of your energy from is aerobic respiration, which requires a steady supply of oxygen. So ventilation is necessary to keep your aerobic respiration running. Chiefly, that is what it's doing. More than anything else, respiratory systems are about providing gas exchange to the animal body, getting in oxygen, getting rid of carbon dioxide. There's a lesser extent to which respiratory systems also aid in a few other tasks. They are involved in your sense of olfaction, the action of sniffing to draw gases up to your olfactory membranes so that you can detect information about your environment. Respiratory systems are involved in vocalization, which has a wide range of functions in different animals. And respiratory systems play a minor role in the cooling of the body through evaporative cooling, exhaled with our breath, and in the elimination of certain other small amounts of gaseous wastes. But for the most part, it's all about the oxygen and the CO2 production. But we'll hit on these other functions as we go. Now, for you to engage in gas exchange, there are two basic things you need. Whatever kind of animal you are, two things are required. First one is you need a respiratory medium. And by the way, careful with the spelling of that word respiratory. It is respiratory, if you pronounce it fully, R-E-S-P-I-R-A-T-O-R-Y. A lot of people mispronounce that. It's respiratory. But you need a respiratory medium. by which I mean, where are you extracting your oxygen from? You basically have two choices, the atmosphere or water. You're either a terrestrial animal, in which case your gas exchange comes primarily via the atmosphere, or you're an aquatic animal, in which case it comes primarily from water. There are animals like amphibians that do a bit of both. Now, if your respiratory medium is the atmosphere, that's a good one. Lots of oxygen there. Between 20 and 21% of Earth's atmosphere is oxygen. Ergo, it's a very rich supply. It is easy to get plentiful oxygen that way. Likewise, fairly easy medium into which to release carbon dioxide. The downside you have with being in an atmosphere is that you have to worry about desiccation of your respiratory membranes, that you have to have adaptations to prevent the respiratory tissues from drying out, because once they're dried out, they will not effectively dissolve gases anymore. Now, your other option is the aquatic medium. If you are an aquatic animal, that is not an air-breathing aquatic animal, let's put it that way. Obviously, if you're a dolphin, you're an air-breathing aquatic animal, the atmosphere is your respiratory medium, even though you live in water all the time. But if you are a fully aquatic animal, then your respiratory medium is the water around you. Now, the amount of dissolved oxygen in any given quantity of water is going to vary, largely depending on how well circulated that body of water is and how deep in it you go. The deeper you go, less oxygen there tends to be. The more circulated it is, the more oxygen there tends to be. But in any case, no matter how well aerated your body of water, water is never as effective a respiratory medium as air is. There's simply not going to be as much oxygen. And what that means is that my aquatic animal has to have some special considerations to try to maximize its oxygen uptake. It is not a coincidence that every endothermic animal is an air breather, for the simple reason that endothermy requires a very high amount of oxygen steadily coming in order to power the very strident endothermic metabolism. You cannot get enough oxygen from a watery medium. It is really not possible to be a mammal with gills because there simply is not enough oxygen available in even a well-aerated body of water to effectively power your respiratory processes. So if an animal is an air breather, that animal is an endotherm. And that is how we are very confident that our water-dwelling reptiles of ages past, such as our mosasaurs, our plesiosaurs, our ichthyosaurs, were air-breathing critters, just like our water-dwelling mammals today are air-breathing critters, because there's really no way to power that size of an animal and that level of metabolic activity with an air-based metabolism. And yeah, we know that our water-dwelling reptiles were live birthing animals and air-breathing animals, which makes it all but certain that they were warm-blooded reptiles. All right, now that's one thing we need. We need a respiratory medium. And if I'm in water, I need to maximize water uptake per surface area of that medium, and I also need to, scale back my metabolism because I'm not going to sustain endothermy. If I'm an air breather, it doesn't guarantee that I'm an endotherm, but it does mean I'm getting much more oxygen per unit of surface area. The downside, of course, is preventing desiccation of the respiratory membrane. Now, that brings us to the second part. In order to get gas exchange with the environment, you need not only a respiratory medium from which to extract oxygen, you need a respiratory membrane with which to do that thing. The respiratory membrane, or let's just say respiratory surface, is a better way of putting it, is going to be a moist surface that oxygen can be dissolved on and that carbon dioxide can be dissolved on. This respiratory surface is going to have to be a thin mucous membrane. Provide moisture and prevent desiccation. It is going to have to be thin to allow easy diffusion of gases. And it is going to have as large a surface area as possible, because the more surface area you've got, the more gas exchange you can do. This is especially important in my aquatic animal, where there is less oxygen per unit of respiratory medium. But even for an air-breathing animal, you have to deal with a large respiratory membrane. In general, my endotherm requires a much larger respiratory surface area than my ectotherm does. lungs. You need a much bigger space with which to absorb gases, because if you don't have a big surface area, you will not get what you need. By way of example, human respiratory system. You have packed into your lungs somewhere approximating 70 square meters of respiratory surface area. And to put that in like a little superlative to show you what would happen, if you were to take all the surface area in your lungs and spread it out flat, you would die. Okay, yeah, but yeah, if you were to take all the surface area in your lungs and spread it out flat, it'd cover about as much space as a tennis court, just to give you an idea how much respiratory surface area you are dealing with. And that is the kind of thing you need to sustain an endotherm of your size. And you're probably thinking, how the hell do I pack 70 square meters of respiratory membrane into my lungs that are right here? We'll talk about that as we go. So, got to have a respiratory medium, you got to have a respiratory membrane. And there are several different ways that we can achieve this. Some animals engage in gas exchange across their entire body surface. For some animals, the entire body surface area is a respiratory membrane. This is particularly the case with flat-bodied animals that have very thin body walls, and with highly porous animals, in which most cells are directly in contact with or near the respiratory medium. It should come as no surprise to you that I'm about to tell you about our very simple friends again, the members of phylum Porifera, the sponges, and the members of phylum Cnidaria, the jellies, as well as the members of phylum Platyhelminthes, the flatworms. Flatworms and jellies have very thin body walls, only 2 cell layers thick in most species, and they're basically, in their entire body surface is a respiratory membrane. Just like they don't need a circulatory system, they also don't need a respiratory system because they're engaging in gas exchange across their entire body. Now, my sponge has a porous body. My sponge has little tiny holes throughout its body, the spongy appearance as we call it. You know, water is filtering all throughout that animal's body. Most individual sponges in the cell's body, most individual cells in the sponge's body are capable of engaging in gas exchange on their own. Most cells in its body are no more than 1 or 2 cells away from a cell in contact with the water, ergo they can easily receive oxygen from it. So if you're a sponge, you don't need a respiratory system either. You just need to continually circulate water through your pores and your spongiceal. Now, any animal with a thicker, more complex body wall, however, is going to need something a little bit more advanced. Now, I should point out that some animals, even those with thick body walls, do engage in external surface gas exchange. That my earthworms, for example, are able to engage in gas exchange across the surface of their skin. Their entire surface area is a respiratory membrane, just like that of a cnidarian. My amphibians, members of the class Amphibia within the vertebrates, the entire surface area of the amphibian body is also a respiratory membrane, and therefore is capable of engaging in gas exchange across all of the body surface. That is the reason, incidentally, that earthworms and amphibians both require moist environments, because both earthworms and amphibians can only engage in gas exchange effectively if they have a moist body surface in which the gases can dissolve. Allow them to become desiccated, they will die of suffocation. For everything else, with a more complex body and a non-absorptive skin, for your reptiles, for your mammals, you're going to have a different kind of respiratory surface. You're either going to have respiratory membranes that are deeply folded inside of bodily compartments, or you're going to have respiratory membranes that are suspended outside of your body or in a specialized body pack within a watery environment. So those animals need a more complex respiratory system. Now, there are 3 basic types of respiratory systems, depending on what kind of structures you use for gas exchange. Let's talk about the first aquatic one to evolve. Obviously, your simplest aquatic animals engage in gas exchange across their cutaneous membranes like the cnidarians do. But the first respiratory system to evolve in aquatic animals, true respiratory system, is going to be a gill system, G-I-L-L. Gills are outfoldings of respiratory membranes suspended in a watery environment. The gill is going to be kind of moving. It's rather than being inwardly folded, it's suspended outward. Think of gills as being kind of like the pages in a book or a packet of paper. You know, they're all. Imagine I take this packet of paper and I suspend it in a watery environment, and all the pages are separating from each other. That's in a lot of ways what gills are like. They're respiratory membranes kind of floating separately from each other in a watery environment, suspended there to engage in gas exchange across their entire surface. The cool thing about a gill, remember that we have to maximize the amount of oxygen that we're taking in a gill system because water is a relatively oxygen-poor environment. By having that membrane suspended out in the water, we can engage in gas exchange on both sides of it, and therefore we can effectively maximize the surface area available for gas exchange. By having multiple layers of gills, we can take in as much oxygen as possible. Now, in some animals, the gills are widely distributed around the body. If you look at certain segmented worms that are aquatic in nature, they have gills all along the length of their body. If you look at some of your sea stars, you look at your echinoderms, you're going to have gills all along the bottom surface of the animal's body. So that's one way of doing it. Other animals will have their gills localized in specific areas of the body. For example, fishes keep their gill, and sharks keep their gills, and sharks are not fishes, by the way. I don't know if I told you all this. A shark is not a fish. Sharks are a member of an older order class, I should say, of vertebrates called the chondrichthyans. C-H-O-N-D-R-O-I-C-H-T-H-Y-A, chondrichthyans. Chondrichthyans are going to be our early cartilaginous fish, cartilage-based skeleton, and they're the precursors of modern fish, which are osteichthyans, O-S-T-E-O ichthyans, which basically means that they are bony fish. So sharks and fishes both have gills kept in specialized pouches known as pharyngeal pouches, P-H-A-R-N-Y-G-E-A-L, from pharynx, also known as gill slits. So that's one way of localizing your gills to a particular area of the body. Crustaceans, by contrast, keep their gills on the underside of their bodies. And if you look at the underside of a crustacean, you'll see a lot of little feathery things on the underside of its body. Those are its gill membranes. Now, because water is relatively poor area, poor oxygen-wise, not only do we need as much gill surface area as possible, but we need to keep the gills very well ventilated. We need to make sure that water is flowing over them continuously to make sure that there's always freshly oxygenated water coming in. A couple ways of achieving that. One way is that fishes will suck water into their body. They will open their mouth, they'll suck in water, it will flow over the gills, and then the gill slit will pump to squeeze the water out. So you see your fish in your fish tank going all the time. Yeah, they're pulling in water, and then they're pushing it out through the gill slits, which you'll see flapping away in there. When you see that, that's the gill slit, not the gill itself flapping on the external surface. The gills are inside. If you are a crustacean, you ventilate with the help of special paddle-like appendages that beat back and forth to push a steady current of water flowing over the gills. Next time you find yourself in a grocery store or a restaurant that has a tank of lobsters, go over to the lobster tank and look at the lobsters crawling up the side in a desperate and futile effort to escape their fate, and you will see on the underside of their bodies, you'll see the little paddly appendages going, pushing a steady flow of water over the feathery gills on their underside. So your crayfish, your lobsters, your crabs tend to have structures like that. Now, another way that animals with gills maximize oxygen uptake is through what's called counter current exchange. Countercurrent, countercurrent, one word. In countercurrent exchange, what this basically means is that as the animal swims in one direction, water flows over its gills in the other direction. So my fish, here's my fish, going this way. Water is flowing over the animal's gills as the fish moves forward, and that means that any given quantity of water taken in by that animal moves along the entire length of the gill before being pumped out. Ergo, the fish has maximum opportunity to absorb oxygen from that water, and as long as it continues moving forward, the current will continue, and we will continually bring in a fresh supply of oxygenated water, thereby extracting the most possible oxygen from it. Thanks to countercurrent exchange, a fish in motion can easily absorb 80% of the oxygen in the water surrounding itself, which is actually much higher than your rate of how much atmospheric oxygen you're absorbing. So gills work pretty well. Fishes have them. Some kinds of invertebrate worms have them. Your sharks have them. And some amphibians have gills. Not all, but some. There are certain amphibians that are exclusively aquatic, like the axolotl, A-X-O-L-O-T-L. I believe that's how you spell it, axolotl. A-X-O-L-O-T-L. Axolotl, yes. The axolotl, look them up, by the way. Axolotls are really cool. They're kind of like, they kind of look like a really happy, weird-looking frog, but they're a strictly aquatic amphibian that has feathery gills located on the sides of its throat. You will find that tadpoles have long, streaming gills located along the length of their bodies, which they lose as the animal matures. Now, the thing about gills is they are strictly useful in an aquatic environment. You cannot effectively ventilate a gill in a terrestrial environment for two reasons. One, because once you're in the terrestrial environment and you have to bear the weight of your body against gravity, the gills collapse. They all stick together, and you lose most of your surface area for the absorption of oxygen. Whenever you're in the water and they can just kind of drift in the water, they can be separate from each other and they can be absorbing oxygen on both surfaces. Put them out of the water, they're going to collapse. The animal can technically respire a little bit, but not very efficiently and usually not for long. Now, the other reason gills don't work well on land is because gills dry out easily. Remember, the gill is a very thin membrane suspended in the watery environments. Put that in an atmosphere, it's going to desiccate very, very quickly and then lose its ability to do its job. So between those two things, gill-based respiratory systems are simply not effective on land. Even though there's much more atmosphere, the problems that come with being in an atmosphere preclude an animal with gills using them for very long. You take a fish out of water, it'll frantically pump its gill slits trying to ventilate its gills. It will be getting some oxygen from the deal, but it can't last forever. Now, let's go with something else. Once we get an animal on land, once we get a terrestrial animal, gill systems aren't going to cut it. The simplest form of terrestrial respiratory system is known as a tracheal system. T-R-A-E-C-H-E-A-L. So no, not T-R-A-E. T-R-A, not T-R-A-E, my bad. T-R-A-C-H-E-A-L. Tracheal systems are primarily used by terrestrial arthropods. Your insects are going to be primarily the ones taking advantage of them. What you're going to have in a tracheal system is a series of branched tubes passing through the animal's body, branching smaller and smaller and smaller throughout its tissue. Those tubes are open to small air pores on the external surface of the animal's body. The finer branches of the tubes at their distal ends reach almost every cell in the animal's body, thereby allowing for effective gas exchange. There's no coupling of the open circulatory system of the insect and its respiratory system. The tracheal system allows oxygen to be passed directly to almost every cell in the body. The hemolymph used in insects is primarily for carrying nutrients and other chemicals around. Now, you get some oxygen in there, but not a lot of that. Now, the tracheal system the open circulatory system isn't needed to transport gases. We're moving other things around with it. The tracheal system does this job all on its own. Now, a tracheal system doesn't have lungs, so we have the problem of moving the air through the animal's body. If I'm a relatively small or thin-bodied insect, diffusion from the atmosphere is enough. Air currents just moving in the air around me will sufficiently ventilate the pores of my body to move air through my tracheae, T-R-A-C-H-A-E. Sorry, okay, this is a weirdly spelled word. T-R-A-C-H-E-A-E, tracheae. That's the plural of trachea, so T-R-A-C-H-E-A. Trachea is an air tube, so tracheae is the plural form. Now, so a little-bodied insect, no problems. Air currents around you will allow oxygen to effectively diffuse into your body. That said, suppose I'm a bigger organism. Then I'm going to have to pump more. The animal will rely on rhythmic movements of its body walls, rhythmic contractions of its thorax and its abdomen to squeeze air in and out of the tracheae, pumping it through continuously to keep that animal going. Or the animal will have to rely on air currents that are stronger to force air into it. This is particularly important for a flying insect. Flight is energetically very expensive. It requires 10 times to 200 times as much oxygen as terrestrial movements. Ergo, my flying bug relies very extensively on the air currents pushing against its body in flight to ensure effective ventilation during that very energy-costly process that it's engaging in. The muscles associated with flight have lots more mitochondria to keep steady aerobic respiration up, but that means lots of oxygen has to be supplied. This, by the way, this inherent limit on tracheal systems, the absence of a pumping lung, means there's a limit to how much air you can squeeze in relative to body size just by squeezing the body itself. There's a limit to how big you can make your bug. In the 1950s, they had movies about radioactive monsters attacking people. You know, that was a very common plot line. Your big radioactive monster goes after people, your Godzilla or whatever. Well, you had movies like Mothra, where the monster is a giant moth, and there was a movie called Them, T-H-E-M, exclamation point in the title, Them, about giant ants attacking people. Your giant ant or your giant moth is not logistically feasible. Why? Because the atmosphere is not going to furnish enough oxygen for them without a pump. That if I've got my car-sized ant or my building-destroying moth, squeezing of its body walls is not going to pump adequate air through those tiny little body passages to get every cell the oxygen that it requires. Ergo, my tracheal system poses an inherent upward limit on the body size of an insect or other animal that's getting its oxygen in that way. For those of you math folks listening, it's the good old square cube law that the volume of an object grows faster than its surface area, which means that as my insect gets bigger and bigger, it's got more surface area to feed, but a lot more volume that it needs to worry about providing oxygen to. So yeah, my car-sized insect is not practical. But I would like to point out a thing, that in past periods of Earth's history, when the planet's atmosphere had a higher oxygen saturation than it has today, you could in fact grow a bigger bug. This is not to say that, car-sized beetles were feasible in the Devonian period, but it is to say that during earlier periods of our planet's history, you could in fact sustain larger insects because there was more oxygen coming in per unit of air, and therefore a tracheal system actually was a more viable approach for a slightly larger animal. If you go to the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, you will see the diorama they have on early Pennsylvanian life, the Carboniferous period, and above that diorama you'll see suspended a dragonfly about yay long. That's not an animal we can sustain in today's atmosphere, but at that time that was feasible. All right, so tracheal systems, pretty much an insect thing, and have some inherent limits on how well they can ventilate the organism. Their benefit is that they're not very energy costly to maintain since they don't have a pump of any kind, but downside is they inherently limit how big my bug can get. So let's go to the kind of respiratory system that you are most familiar with, the pulmonary system. P-U-L-M-O-N-A-R-Y, pulmonary. The word pulmonary, you probably know, means having to do with lungs. So a pulmonary system confines the respiratory membrane to a single location, specifically to an internally folded sac-like organ called a lung, which has very dense capillary beds throughout its tissue and a very thin epithelial lining, allowing for maximal diffusion of oxygen. Lungs are found in a number of different organisms. Spiders have lungs, snails have lungs, and all vertebrates, or rather I should say all terrestrial vertebrates. Okay, let's back that up. Most terrestrial vertebrates have lungs. I had to keep correcting myself there because I stopped to think about it and I said, okay, all vertebrates? No, that includes sharks and fishes, most of which do not have lungs. There is, in fact, a kind of fish that has a lung. It's called a lungfish, as you might gather from its name. They use it as a secondary respiratory organ. They have both gills and lungs, and they use the lung to respire during the period of the year when the streams that they live in dry up and they burrow down into the mud underneath. But so that's a weird example of a fish with a lung. The example of a terrestrial animal without a lung would be a lot of amphibians, numerous kinds of amphibians, because remember, they're getting a lot of their gas exchange through their skin. They have a cutaneous respiratory system. So many amphibians only have very small or stunted lungs because they rely primarily on their skin as their respiratory organ. And some amphibian species, such as many salamanders and the axolotl, do not have lungs at all, relying exclusively on gill systems, cutaneous respiration, or some combination of the above. But aside from those weird amphibians that lack that quality, all terrestrial vertebrates are possessed of lungs, as are all aquatic reptiles and mammals. Now, the lung originated as a secondary respiratory organ in fishes. It evolved from a special air sac found in some fishes called a swim bladder, and most fishes have a swim bladder today. It's an air-filled compartment that allows the animal to control its buoyancy in the water column. It's not a very far step for evolution to add a thin absorptive membrane on the inside of the swim bladder, allowing it to carry out a secondary role as an oxygen processing chamber. And it's from that swim bladder that we ultimately see the evolutionary origins of the lung as a distinctive structure, first appearing in amphibians and then later in other terrestrial vertebrates. Now, that means that most reptiles, all reptiles that are presently living, all reptiles that we know of, including extinct ones, all mammals, all birds have pulmonary systems. They have lung-based systems. Most amphibians have at least small lungs, some lack lungs at all. The majority of animals with a pulmonary system have paired lungs. They have left and right lungs. There are some exceptions to this. Snakes and some lizard species only have a single lung, but in general, lungs appear as paired organs on either side of the animal's thoracic cavity. In most species, the heart is right between them, making it proximal to the lungs for ease of access to the pulmonary circuit for respiration. Now, the size and complexity of the lung is going to be directly proportional to the metabolic rate of the animal. If you have a higher metabolic rate, we are consuming oxygen more rapidly. Ergo, we need a bigger lung and we need a more complex lung in order to take in the oxygen that you might require. So, what are the benefits of a pulmonary system? As compared to the other systems that we have right now, pulmonary systems allow for a muscular pumping action. Muscles can inflate and deflate the lungs, ventilating air, constantly pulling in a steady supply of fresh air in an atmosphere. That's a definite benefit. We don't have to rely on air currents like a tracheal system in our insects. Another benefit of having a lung is that, just a bit of hair sticking out there. Okay. Okay, we're just going to have to live with it. All right, but another benefit of having a lung is that the lung is an internalized respiratory membrane. This means that it's a lot easier to keep it moist by having it folded inside of the body rather than suspended in an external environment. That means that the membrane is kept inherently moist by the internal environment of the body. It does not lose moisture as readily. Even so, our lungs do still have mucus and serous fluids in them to keep them from desiccating. But having them folded inward means that that desiccation is a lot less than if they were openly exposed to the external environment. So this solves two of the big problems with going into a terrestrial environment. This solves the problem of your desiccation issue and also solves the problem of a ventilation issue by having a muscular pumping action associated with it. Downside, as with so many advanced structures in vertebrates, is anatomical complexity. Lungs are much more complex organs than your gills or your tracheal systems. They are much more difficult to maintain, and as with so many specialized systems, once you come to rely on them, we don't have much of a backup. If you do not have functioning lungs, you do not have an effective way to bring oxygen into your body. The overwhelming majority of animals working with a pulmonary system do not have a secondary form of oxygen intake. Now, if you're an amphibian, the pulmonary system is your secondary form of oxygen intake. Amphibians rely primarily on their cutaneous respiration, that is respiration across the moist membrane of their skin. For them, the lung is a secondary respiratory organ if they have it at all. But mammals and reptiles do not have that option. We as mammals, reptiles, birds, we do not have the option of cutaneous respiration. There is one exception in the world of reptiles. Turtles have moist membranes around the mouth and around the anus that allow a very limited amount of gas exchange across those membranes, but even so, it only supplies a tiny percentage of the animal's oxygen, certainly not enough to compensate for a lung that wasn't working. If you're a mammal or a bird, lungs are all you got going on. You do not have a mechanism to pull in oxygen to your body another way. So, how do we make this go? How do lungs and respiratory systems function? So let's talk a little bit about respiratory layouts. I'm going to use the mammalian respiratory tract as my first example, but we are going to talk about a couple of others as we get a little further along here. In mammals, we are going to have a lung located in the thoracic cavity, the main chest cavity of the body, Thoracic, thoracic from thorax, Thorax, which refers to the central mass or chest of the organism. Now, typically, we can divide respiratory tracts into upper and lower portions. We have an upper respiratory tract, we have a lower respiratory tract. Now, the upper respiratory tract begins with organs cephalized in the head. All vertebrates use cephalized passages for the intake and release of environmental oxygen, or carbon dioxide, or gases in general, I should be saying. Now, that for us basically means the oral cavity and the nasal cavity, that you have three openings in your face that allow for the intake of oxygen. You have the nares, which are your nostrils, N-A-R-E-S, singular form if you're talking about just one of them is naris, N-A-R-I-S. And then you have paired nares. Most animals will have paired nares. There are some exceptions. In whales and dolphins, for example, the nostrils have not only migrated to the top of the animal's head, but they have fused into one single air passage that we call the blowhole, B-L-O-W-H-O-L-E as one word, which the animal surfaces with. The of water that comes out as the animal spraying water away from its blowhole. It takes deep breaths in through that opening, and then it can dive again. So that is an exception to our rule of having paired nares. Oral cavity is also usable as a pathway for the intake of air. It is our secondary pathway for doing so. We are optimized to utilize the nasal passageways to bring air into the body. That is the chief method by which we engage in ventilation, but the mouth is a secondary ventilation passageway. Now, the reason that the nares are the primary opening for ventilation is because you move up through the nares, through those two passages, into the nasal cavity. And in the nasal cavity, we are going to find first a moist mucous epithelium, whose job is to trap particles that come in, like small particles, bacteria, whatever. They're also going to find a lot of hairs in the nasal passageway, guard hairs. They're technically called vibrissae, Vibrissae. Vibrissae, or guard hairs, protect against particles entering the nasal passage, or in particular against insects that might enter the nasal passage of an organism. Whenever the nares are tickled, it triggers a sneeze reflex to expel whatever the obstruction is that's getting into the nasal passage. So air coming up through the nasal passages is filtered in this way through a combination of mucus lining and the hairs within it. By the way, your cat, whiskers. Whiskers are vibrissae. They are extensions of the guard hairs that are still sensitive to touch and used by the cat to detect basically where it is safe for its head to go. That a cat will generally not willingly, if it has another option, crawl into an opening that its whiskers will brush the sides of, because that's basically the cat's measure of saying, this is wide enough for my whole body to fit. So vibrissae have been adapted in felids for that specialized purpose, and in a few other animals as well. Now, move up through there. Not only are you filtering the air coming in to cleanse it, but you are warming and humidifying that air as it comes through that moist mucus-lined passageway, and that in turn is going to make the air less, moistening it less dry, which makes it less likely to crack or desiccate the delicate respiratory membranes further down in. Making it warmer also reduces damage possible from the inhalation of cold air into a warm body passageway. You will find that the nasal cavity is directly attached to a number of compartments in the skull known as sinuses. The word sinus, you've heard a few contexts by now. It basically means a cavity or a space, S-I-N-U-S. The sinuses in your skull, we call them paranasal, P-A-R-A-N-A-S-A-L, sinuses, because their job is to basically, they extend from the nasal cavity, they lighten the skull, and they also provide air spaces within the skull to provide resonance for vocalization. It adds resonance to animal vocalizations, having those paranasal sinuses. Of course, those paranasal sinuses can also get blocked up with mucus and potentially be infected. There's your evolutionary trade-off. You will also note oral cavity intake as well, going through the mouth, going through the oral cavity. Both of these connect at the pharynx. There is in mammals a separation between oral and nasal cavity. We have two separate passageways, one for air, one for food, which, as previously discussed, means that you as a mammal can chew while you're breathing. And that's a very important adaptation to endothermy, because it means you can break your food apart more thoroughly, process it more thoroughly, therefore extract more nutrients from it. And you can also keep bringing in fresh oxygen while you are chewing it thoroughly. And both high nutrient supply and high oxygen supply are vital for maintaining the high endothermic metabolism. So the hard palate, the plate of bone between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity, is a really important adaptation for mammals. Now, at the posterior of the nasal cavity, we are going to move into a compartment called the pharynx, P-H-A-R-Y-N-X, better known as, P-H-A-R-N-Y-X. Wait, lot got lost spelling bee in my head. P-H-A-R-Y-N-X, pharynx, that's correct, yeah. The pharynx is what you know better as your throat, and it actually has three distinct regions. The region directly behind the nasal cavity, the upper portion, is called the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx, N-A-S-O pharynx, is exclusively an air chamber. It is not used for taking in food or drink. You actually have a mass of tissue in the posterior of your mouth that you can feel along the roof of your mouth with your tongue and feel it. Squishy area at the back called the soft palate, P-A-L-A-T-E is palate. The soft palate closes off the nasopharynx when you swallow, so that food and water do not go upwards. You probably have the experience uncomfortably at some point in your life snorting a liquid up into the back of your nose if you laughed while you were swallowing or something like that, and you know it's pretty uncomfortable. Nasopharynx, incidentally, also has two little channels called the eustachian tubes, or auditory tubes. Eustachian, E-U-S-T-A, CHIAN, the eustachian or auditory tubes make the connection between the middle ear and the throat. Why the heck do we have a connection there? It's going to be a remnant of your old pharyngeal slit, folks. During development, when you cephalize, the pharyngeal pouches, the pharyngeal slits in the throat of a developing vertebrates will, if it's not a fish, will migrate up into the head and will become the ear canals. And so that's that passageway, that eustachian tube connecting throat to your middle ear, is their evolutionary remnant. The benefit of that is that that tube lets us equalize pressure on either side of the eardrum by having a way of releasing air pressure internally as well as externally. You know that thing where you pop your jaw and you hear that little pop in your ear? You've just opened up the eustachian tubes nice and wide to allow for equalizing of pressures. Now that's going to be a thing that is a double-edged sword. It can equalize pressure in your ears. Downside of that, of course, is it allows drainage between ear and nasal canal. Infections in one easily travel to the other, hence your ear, nose, and throat doctor. Right, so anyway, air goes to the nasopharynx, then from there down into the oropharynx, O-R-O-pharynx. Oropharynx is a common passageway used by both air and food. It's part of both the digestive and respiratory tracts. From the oropharynx at the bottom, we move into the laryngopharynx, L-A-R-Y-N-G-O-P-H-A-R-Y-N-X, because that word hates you and does not want you to spell it properly. Now, the laryngopharynx branches. You can go two ways with the laryngopharynx. One way leads down to the esophagus, or food tube, going into the stomach. That's not normally the pathway of air. You can swallow some air during swallowing of food, which you then later erupt when you burp. But the other way, branching off of the laryngopharynx, is a little opening called the glottis, G-L-O-T-T-I-S. The glottis is the opening to the lower respiratory tract. Now, when you swallow food, there's a flap of tissue in the throat called the epiglottis, E-P-I glottis. It's a flap of elastic cartilage that folds down over the glottis to close it off and prevent food and drink from going down into the lower respiratory tract. Of course, all of you have the uncomfortable experience of food or drink going down the wrong pipe, as we put it, going down into the lower respiratory tract, which provokes a powerful cough reflex and can therefore also lead to choking if that passageway is completely blocked. But whenever you are breathing, the glottis opens to admit air into that passageway. And then we make the passage from upper to lower respiratory tract. So upper respiratory tract, nares and mouth, nares to nasal cavity to nasopharynx, mouth to oral cavity to oropharynx. Nasopharynx also leads into oropharynx, oropharynx into laryngopharynx, and then finally into the glottis to go into the lower respiratory tract. But you know what? I think that is probably enough for one lesson. So in my next talk, we are going to finish this all out. We're going to talk about lower respiratory tracts in the respiratory systems of vertebrates. We're going to take a look at different kinds of breathing, negative versus positive pressure breathing. We're going to talk about vocalization. We're going to talk about lung capacity, and we're going to talk about how birds do this better than you do. All right, but I think that is enough for you now. So thank you for your attention, folks. I'll talk to you soon. Have a good evening.